Updates on stories developing around the world. First up, the United States has fallen short of its vaccination goal set by US President Joe Biden. Biden had aimed at 70% of American adults receiving at least one dose of COVID-19 by July the 4th, America's Day of Independence. However, data suggests only 67% of US adults have received one dose so far. We get you the details, but first, let's take a look at the top headlines. More than 1,000 Afghan troops flee into neighbouring Tajikistan following clashes with the Taliban, as several key districts in the northern region fall to the militant group. Hackers suspected to be behind a mass extortion attack that affected hundreds of companies worldwide demand $70 million to restore the data they are holding ransom, according to a posting on a dark website. The US falls short of its July 4th vaccination goal. Only 18 states surpassed President Biden's hope of giving at least 70% of adults their first dose by Independence Day. The Indian government tells Delhi's High Court that Twitter's non-compliance with new IT rules amounts to a breach of provisions, resulting in the social media giant losing its immunity conferred under the IT Act. A day after banning ride-hailing giant Didi from app stores, China widens a crackdown on its embattled technology sector by announcing probes into 2 more US-listed Chinese companies. Pope Francis is doing well after surgery for an inflamed colon, but the 84-year-old is expected to spend around 7 days recovering in hospital. The United States vaccination rate has been declining over the past few weeks, and according to reports, just 18 states have surpassed President Biden's goal of partially or fully vaccinating at least 70% of their residents by July the 4th. Among the minority of states that did reach that goal, Vermont, Hawaii and Massachusetts had the highest vaccination rates. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, states including Mississippi, Louisiana and Wyoming are yet to cross even the 50% mark. A reflection of the political divide has been evident in the overall vaccine rollout. Most of the Midwest and Eastern states have lagged far behind in their programs, divided starkly by party lines. The states with the lowest inoculation rates are overwhelmingly red in their political stance. Meanwhile, the United States' top infectious disease expert, Anthony Fauci, has said that around 99% of recent COVID-19 deaths in the United States involved the unvaccinated group. Supporting Fauci's stance, CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky. She said on Thursday that 99.5% of people who died from COVID-19 over the past 6 months were unvaccinated, a stunning statistic in support of that assertion that nearly every COVID-linked death could be preventable. This comes at a time when the US is slowly easing its restrictions and reopening businesses in an attempt to restore some normalcy. Meanwhile, another CDC report has now claimed that more than 1 in 10 people in the US have missed their second dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. According to the CDC data, nearly 11% of people who had sufficient time to get the second dose missed their ideal window. Second doses were considered missed if more than 42 days had passed since the initial jab. In California, Los Angeles County public health officials have advised mask wearing in indoor public spaces to deal with rising COVID-19 cases involving the Delta variant. Because of the variant's rapid spread in the state, the advisory applies even to those who have been vaccinated against the virus. Voice of America gets us the details.
The health advisory came just 2 weeks after California authorities had lifted most coronavirus restrictions in the state. The recommendation to resume wearing masks in public spaces because of the spreading Delta variant appeared on the Los Angeles Health Department's Twitter feed on June 28th. The news both puzzled and upset many LA residents. Kaylee was among them.
I've been vaccinated. I honestly believe that if you've been vaccinated and everyone else has been vaccinated, I don't think we need the masks anymore. I'm going to walk right in there and enjoy the fact that I get to go to the grocery store and be able to breathe.
Yet, many residents are following the advisory and are concerned about the new coronavirus variants.
Probably yes, if they would say so. I'm not vaccinated yet, but if they suggest us to do so, I'll do it.
In May, only about 4% of those infected with COVID-19 had the Delta variant. By June, this figure had climbed to 14.5%.
Заразность этого вируса намного выше, чем, например, у вируса гриппа.
This variant of the virus is a lot more contagious than, say, the common flu. This new Delta variant has more common traits with human protein. That's why it's so contagious.
И поэтому его заразность намного выше.
The good news is that the vaccines, at least for which we have data, and that includes the Pfizer vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine, still seem to be effective in preventing hospitalizations and serious disease from the Delta variant. But the bad news is it is more infectious. That means it spreads more easily.
Experts say the Delta variant is especially dangerous for those who have not been vaccinated or have received just one dose of a 2-dose vaccine. Also vulnerable are fully vaccinated people who suffer from chronic diseases or have a weakened immune system. That's why the county recommended that people start wearing masks again.
The reason why I think they're suggesting that even vaccinated people wear masks indoors is because we know most of the transmission from SARS-CoV-2 occurs indoors. And really the risk of catching SARS-CoV-2 when you're outside, particularly when you're physically distancing, is extremely low. But indoors, when you're around other people, close together, particularly when you're there for longer periods of time, that's where transmission's more likely to occur, and wearing masks will help to prevent that.
People in California, unlike those in some other states, are getting their shots. Almost half of all state residents are fully vaccinated. The high vaccination numbers lead experts to believe there won't be another strict lockdown in California. Over 154 million people have been fully vaccinated in the U.S. For Angelina Bagdasaryan in Los Angeles, Anna Rice, VOA News.
In order to boost its vaccine arsenal, Taiwan is planning to give emergency approval to 2 new vaccines, even before completion of their final stage trials. The 2 vaccines, backed by the Taiwanese government, have passed their Phase 1 and Phase 2 trials, but they haven't had the large-scale Phase 3 trials that vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna have been through. That stage involves a comparative study of vaccinated and non-vaccinated groups of people. Taiwanese makers will now have to demonstrate that the homegrown vaccines generate antibodies at the same level as the AstraZeneca vaccine, which has already been approved for use in Taiwan. Taiwan's push to shortcut vaccine approval, meanwhile, has sparked debate across the country.
No one is against, our domestic vaccine, but it's just the uncertainty, and then can we just not do it properly? And then, to have more evidence and such that then we will use the vaccine, with much higher level of confidence.
At the end of May, Chen Pei-jie, a member of the expert committee of Taiwan's drug regulatory body, resigned. Chen's resignation came after he learned that Taiwan's Food and Drug Administration had planned to take a regulatory shortcut in approving 2 vaccines being developed in Taiwan. The shortcut would allow the shots to be given to people for emergency use before the vaccines have finished the final stage of testing. The proposed shortcut comes as Taiwan scrambles to get adequate amounts of vaccines amid its worst outbreak since the beginning of the pandemic. UNESCO's World Heritage Sites have felt the impact of the coronavirus pandemic as travel restrictions have limited visitors' access to those places. While the organisation expects to come out of this health crisis stronger, it faces other challenges ranging from climate change to a lack of funding. Take a look at this report.
According to UNESCO, at certain points during the pandemic, up to 90% of sites were closed. This has resulted in less cash flows to fund crucial restoration projects. While the shutdown has affected cash flow, it has also been a welcome rest for popular locations and an opportunity to carry out work. The World Heritage Center has used the pandemic months to draw up plans to help sites cope.
In some sites, and I would like to add Angkor to that, they used the time to do restorations because the tourists were actually not on site. In some other sites, it was also a lack of monitoring. Because the people couldn't go and work at the site. Some sites were totally closed.
On the other hand, climate change is turning out to be a potential threat for these sites. The International Union for Conservation of Nature said that 16 sites had deteriorated since 2017, while only 8 improved.
I think we have a lot of World Heritage Sites which are impacted from climate change. There have been studies, for example, in the Mediterranean, on the cities in the Mediterranean. One of the examples is, of course, Venice with the sea level rise and the flooding, increased flooding, frequent weather events like storms, etc. So you see that, and we have now more scientific data that many World Heritage Sites are impacted.
Money is needed to put in place protections against climate change. Governments of countries that host sites have a replaces. The Heritage Committee is struggling to support that effort.
I think the biggest challenge of the World Heritage we get more sites on the list, but neither the staffing at UNESCO increases nor the funding increases fundamentally.
The World Heritage Committee has an annual budget of $4 million and 1,121 places on its list. This month, 45 other sites will be considered for inclusion. Not having enough money to safeguard all sites could result in their deterioration in the future.
If we are not able to safeguard the best places on Earth, which we have all agreed among all 194 countries, that these are the places we need to preserve, that the future generations have a right to see those places, I think we have failed.
Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
As climate change and global warming continue to impact on weather systems, many countries around the world are grappling with the devastating effects of heat waves. US President Joe Biden met with cabinet and emergency officials to discuss the heat wave, wildfires and drought in the west of the United States. Each poses a threat in different communities. Voice of America reports on how US farmers are suffering.
Amid record-high heat blamed for several deaths in Washington state and Western Canada, President Joe Biden conferred with officials and Western governors. Meanwhile, in Shoshone, Idaho, farmer and cattle rancher Carl Pendleton is feeling the effects of the changing climate. Pendleton also heads a company that operates an irrigation system. While some farmers have access to underground water, this system is the only source of water for his farm.
Well, we're in the bottom of the Richfield Canal. Normally this water, standing here, water would be at least up to my neck, maybe up to the top of my head.
But in places it's bone dry after a winter with little rain or snow in the nearby mountains. Melting snow usually replenishes the water system in summer. This reservoir typically starts the season with more than 235 million cubic meters of water. It started with less than 1/4 of that this year.
Why we have endured many short water years. It's very uncommon that we don't have water to get us at least to mid-July. And we were turned off, we exhausted our resource on the 10th of June this year.
It's the driest year in this water district since 1955. A meager alfalfa and grain crop means Pendleton's cattle won't have enough feed.
Why we've chosen, rather than buy hay or truck cattle to some place where there is feed, why in my case we've decided to sell this livestock.
And run a more limited operation than his family has done since they came here in the 1940s. Pendleton says the American farm system is diversified and resilient, but government, which provides agricultural subsidies, has a role to play where the food supply is threatened.
We certainly don't want to be welfare children out here. We'd rather get our money in the marketplace, but if you want to preserve our food supply, I think there's a necessary investment there.
A buffer for struggling small farms like his to stay in business. With Natasha Mosgavaya in Shoshone, Idaho, Mike O'Sullivan, VOA News in Los Angeles.
The Vatican has issued a statement on Pope Francis's health condition. They have announced that he is doing well after intestinal surgery. The 84-year-old pontiff was hospitalised the first time since his election in 2013. Vatican spokesman Matteo Bruni has said that the pontiff responded well to the surgery. He underwent a 3-hour operation which involved removing half of his colon. There has been no information about when the Pope will be discharged. However, he was expected to convalesce for a few days in a private ward reserved for popes. Pope Francis was admitted to Rome's Gemelli Hospital. The Vatican had confirmed that the surgery was not prompted by an emergency.
My first reaction is to pray for the successful operation of our Pope Francis, that may God give him more strength, no? And then also to guide all our doctors and nurses.
Preghiamo per lui che questo intervento va tutto bene e in comunità abbiamo pregato anche il rosario stamattina durante la preghiera, l'abbiamo ricordato nelle preghiere e l'auguriamo ogni bene che si riprende presto.
Pope Francis is said to be in generally good health but has breathing problems after having part of one of his lungs removed as a young man. He also suffers from sciatica, a painful condition where a nerve affects the lower back and leg, and that's forced him to skip scheduled appearances at times. The Pope made no mention of his health condition when he addressed thousands of people in St. Peter's Square for his Sunday blessing. He also announced a planned trip to Slovakia and Budapest for September. All this was done just hours before he was taken for the surgery. Two crew members of China's Tiangong space station completed their first spacewalk. The 3 astronauts blasted off the Shenzhou 12 spaceship on June the 17th and will remain in space for a duration of 3 months. The mission is the first of 11 needed to complete the construction of the Tiangong space station. Here are the details.
Nearly 13 years after China's first spacewalk, 2 Chinese astronauts have made a second foray into space outside the Tiangong space station. Chinese astronauts Liu Boming and Tang Hongbo floated out of the space station's core module.
Wow, it's so beautiful outside, so bright.
They spent 7 hours outside the space station, and carried out extravehicular activities before returning safely. Their tasks included elevating a panoramic camera outside the Tianhe core module and testing the station's robotic arm, which will be used to transfer future modules around the station.
It is flecked with white clouds. Some of them are in layers. Some of them are like the ocean, and some of them are like layers of ice. You can follow the camera outside the space station, follow my steps, and fly freely together.
I think today's extravehicular activities have fully verified the functions and performance of the EMU spacesuit. Because the performance was very stable during the 7 hours of extravehicular work, so it's really excellent.
On the 17th of June, 3 Chinese astronauts blasted off on the Shenzhou 12 spaceship. The first of the 11 missions needed to complete China's own space station. Tiangong's construction is a major step in China's ambitious space program. The 3-component space station is under construction in a low Earth orbit about 390 kilometers above the ground. China aims to complete the Tiangong station program before the end of 2022. It's not just scientific explorations alone. Beijing is working speedily to make itself a space superpower, one that may even rival the US. Beijing is also working with Moscow to build a base on the moon. Clearly, it's the final frontier which the Chinese want to dominate. Bureau Report, WION, World as One.
Several houses were destroyed and roads were buried under mud after landslides tore through the city of Atami in Japan on Saturday. Rescue operations continued in Japan on Monday for survivors. At least 3 people have been reported to have died and over 80 people are still missing. Around 130 buildings were affected by the calamity in Atami. Additional rescue teams have been pressed into service. Here's a report.
Japanese rescue efforts were hampered on Sunday by ongoing weather concerns after fatal landslides caused by torrential rains hit the country over the weekend. That's according to local Kyodo news agency, which added that on Saturday, about 130 buildings in the central city of Atami were affected by floods, landslides and cascading mud. One resident, 55-year-old Naoto Date, says he's never seen such devastation before.
We had minor landslides in the past, decades ago. However, this is the first time we've had a disaster on such a scale that the Self-Defense Forces and rescue crew from Tokyo's Fire and Disaster Department needed to come. Usually, even if there is a disaster, it could just be handled by the local fire department. Even my mother said that we have never had such a big landslide before.
Some 700 people, including police, firefighters and the military, were deployed on rescue missions. But their operations were interrupted by more rain and threats of landslides. Kyodo reported, however, that teams successfully evacuated nearly 400 people as of Sunday morning. Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga told people in affected areas to remain on alert and continue to take precautions.
The Japanese Ever Given ship that blocked Egypt's Suez Canal in March is set to be released this week. The ship has been retained since it was stuck in high winds and remained wedged across the canal for 6 days, disrupting global trade. Egypt retained the ship as it was seeking compensation from Japanese firm Shoei Kisen-Kaisha. The compensation would make up for lost canal revenues and costs of salvaging it and for damages to the canal. The MV Ever Given is with deadweight tonnage of 199,000 and got stuck diagonally across the canal during a sandstorm on March the 23rd. The trade artery was blocked for 6 days before it was dislodged. The Taiwanese-operated ship was moved to unobstructed anchorage after it was freed on March the 29th. According to the Suez Canal Authority, Egypt lost between $12 million and $15 million in revenues for each day the waterway was closed. Initially, Egypt had sought hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation, but it later slashed its initial claim of $900 million to $550 million. The authority that manages the vital waterway said a deal was reached with its Japanese owners. However, the statement does not disclose the amount of compensation. According to official figures, the Suez Canal earned Egypt just over $5.7 billion in the fiscal year 2019 to 2020, which changed a little from the $5.3 billion earned back in 2014. On July the 7th, a ceremony would be held to mark the signing of an accord with the vessel's owners and the departure of the ship. Performers, guests and organisers are geared up for Hungary's annual drag queen competition. But as the country's new anti-LGBTQ law comes into effect next week, drag performers fear for their future. The law passed by the Hungarian Parliament on June the 15th bans dissemination of content in schools that promotes homosexuality. Take a look at this report.
As anti-LGBTQ+ laws come into effect in Hungary next week, these drag performers say they fear for their future. In June, Hungary passed legislation that bans the dissemination of content in schools which is deemed to promote homosexuality and gender risk. Under the new law, drag shows will not be banned, but they will, and no minors are allowed in the audience. Organizers at a contest on Saturday said they feared its impact. Taylor worries that the law could embolden intolerance of the community. Event organizer Tamás Doka said that the venue, which is on the outskirts of Budapest, was partly chosen for security reasons. Hungary's hardline nationalist Prime Minister Viktor Orban has grown increasingly radical on social policy, railing against LGBTQ+ people and immigrants.
Florida's lime pie eating competition was held on July the 4th. Participants could be seen smothered with whipped cream during the challenge. The contest holds significance as the famous pie is believed to have originated in the subtropical island of Key West in the late 1800s. Let's take a look at the visuals as we wrap up this bulletin. Stay tuned to WION, World at One.
One World Trade Center that is the one where the impact.
The cause of India's freedom for many years.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.
America is a constant work in progress.
WION, India's global voice, the channel that brings you the biggest stories from across the world through India's lens. Now available in more than 190 countries worldwide. Because we believe that the world is one. Watch us in Africa, Europe, USA and Canada, South America, Asia Pacific, Middle East and North African regions. Also available on these digital platforms across the world. WION, World is One.
vielleicht nur als Impostant.
Hello and welcome to WION Live broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett, and in this bulletin we'll bring you updates on stories developing around the world. Our top story for today comes from Afghanistan, where the Taliban has captured over 120 districts in the last 2 months. But now it's facing a counter-offensive from Afghan forces. We'll take a look at these so-called clean-up operations being carried out by Afghan troops. But first, the headlines. Dozens of women in Afghanistan's Ghor province take up arms and march through the streets, pledging their support to Afghan security forces and protesting against the Taliban's violation of women's rights. China tightens regulations on data security after ride-hailing giant Didi is removed. China launches a cybersecurity probe into more US-listed firms, including online recruiter Zpin.com. South Africa's former president Jacob Zuma refuses to surrender by a court-set deadline and compares the Constitutional Court judge to apartheid-era rulers. Zuma was sentenced to 15 months in jail for contempt of court. Rebel leaders in Ethiopia's war-torn Tigray region set strict conditions for a ceasefire. They demand the withdrawal of Eritrean forces and the restoration of the dislodged Tigray government. Amid massive protests, Chile installs a new 155-member body charged with writing a new constitution. An indigenous Mapuche woman will be the lead architect of Chile's new constitution.